By the end of this module, a capable manager should be able to say, I can move decisions forward without authority by framing the work clearly and standing behind my judgment. At this level, leadership no longer stops at your team boundary. Influence is not about persuasion tactics or political maneuvering. It's about credibility, how your thinking lands, how your judgment holds under scrutiny, and how consistently you show up when stakes are high. This module focuses on how leaders influence upwards and across the organization without positional power, how they frame work so it earns attention, how they align peers without forcing consensus, and how they navigate competing interests without compromising integrity. The goal is not to expand your control, it's to extend your impact without losing your footing. At this level of leadership, authority reaches its limit. Influence does the rest. Influence is not manipulation, charm, or persuasion tactics. It's the ability to align people around a shared outcome when priorities collide, reporting lines don't apply, and the stakes extend beyond your team. This is where strong leadership either compounds or stalls. At a certain point, doing good work is no longer enough. You can be competent, prepared, and thoughtful, and still watch decisions move in a different direction. You've probably felt this. You bring a well-considered recommendation, you explain your reasoning, and the conversation drifts or stalls, or worse, gets overridden. Not because your idea was wrong, because influence wasn't established. Influence doesn't break down because leaders lack authority. It breaks down because leaders rely on logic without shaping how the decision is being framed. And unframed decisions default to power, habit, or politics. I remember assuming that strong analysis would speak for itself. I was presenting a lot of information, but I underestimated the level of political influence. I was seeking a specific level of support, but I hadn't framed it appropriately. I was clear, I was prepared, but what I didn't see was that others were answering a different question entirely. Once I learned to shape the frame of the decision, my influence changed dramatically without having to push harder. Many capable leaders believe influence comes from being impressive. More data, more explanation, and more context. Influence comes from helping others see the decision clearly, not from overwhelming them with information. Influence is not about persuasion, it's about framing. If the question isn't defined, the decision won't be either. When leaders learn to influence this way, meetings get shorter, resistance decreases, and decisions move forward faster. Not because people agree more, but because the work is positioned clearly. In the next part of this module, we'll look at how leaders frame decisions before advocating for an outcome, because influence is won long before anyone says yes or no. Most leaders try to influence by advocating too soon. They arrive with a recommendation, they explain their reasoning, and they hope the logic carries the day. When it doesn't, they push harder, but that rarely works. Framing is not persuasion. Framing is helping others understand what decision they are actually being asked to make. Until that's clear, advocacy lands in different places for different people. Without a shared frame, some people think it's a resource question, others think it's a risk question, and others think it's a timing question. Everyone will respond to the part that they care about, and the conversation scatters. I remember presenting a recommendation that I thought was solid. I walked through the analysis, I covered the risk and the steps forward. But instead of agreement, I got confusion and pushback. Questions came quickly. Are you asking for approval? Is this final? What decision do you need from us? That's when I realized I hadn't clarified the type of decision that I was asking for. Was this for input, alignment, or approval? When I reframed the conversation, what I'm asking for today is approval to move forward with this approach. The same recommendation landed very differently. The discussion shifted from uncertainty to decision. Before advocating for an outcome, leaders need to do one thing. They need to name the decision, not the solution, the decision. Most leadership decisions fall into one of three frames. The first is direction. We're deciding which path to commit to. The second is trade-off. We're deciding what you're willing to give up to move forward. The third is risk. We're deciding what level of uncertainty we're willing to accept. When the frame is clear, people know how to evaluate the recommendation. In practice, framing sounds like this. Before we get into options, let's align on the decision we're making. This is a trade-off decision, not a quality one. The risk here is timing, not capability. Notice what this does. It slows the conversation just enough to make it productive. Advocacy answers the question, but framing defines the question. Leaders who skip framing argue about answers that aren't even being evaluated in the same way. When leaders frame first, resistance drops, debate sharpens, and influence increases without force. Not because people are convinced, because they're aligned on what matters. Before you offer a recommendation, I want you to ask yourself this leadership check-in question. Have I named the decision clearly enough that others can evaluate it the same way? If not, pause, frame first. Framing gets leaders heard. The next challenge is holding your ground when others disagree or they push back. That's where influence either compounds or collapses. Once leaders start framing decisions clearly, a new fear shows up. And here's a leadership check-in question for you. What happens when someone senior disagrees with me? Or worse, dismisses the idea entirely? Under pushback, leaders often react in one of two ways. The first is retreat. They soften their position, they backpedal, they defer prematurely. And the second is escalation. They argue harder, they defend their logic line by line, and they turn the conversation into a contest. But neither builds influence. Holding ground is not digging in. It's staying anchored while remaining open. Leaders don't need to win the argument. They need to keep the decision intact. When faced with disagreement, effective leaders do three things. First, they acknowledge the concern, not defensively and not dismissively. Simply, I see the concern you're raising. Second, they restate the frame. This decision is about timing, not capability. The trade-off we're weighing is speed versus certainty. This keeps the conversation anchored. Third, they restate their position without elaborating. No over-explaining and no justification spiral. Just, given that, my recommendation remains. This approach does something important. It signals confidence without triggering threat. It shows openness without surrender. And it keeps the decision from dissolving into opinion. Escalation turns disagreement into identity. Once that happens, logic stops mattering. Leaders who hold steady avoid that trap entirely. Here's the distinction I want you to remember. Influence grows when leaders stay grounded, not when they push harder. Calm conviction carries more weight than force ever will. When you feel challenged, ask yourself this leadership check-in. Am I trying to be understood or trying to win? If it's winning, pause, re-anchor instead. Holding ground protects your influence in the moment. The final piece is learning how influence compounds over time, and that's what we'll look at next. The most effective influence doesn't happen in a single meeting. It compounds. Over time, certain leaders stop having to push for influence. They're sought out. At this level, influence isn't about getting your way. It's about being trusted with how decisions are shaped. Leaders who reach this point aren't persuasive. They're relied upon. The difference is not seniority, and it's not personality. It's how consistently a leader frames decisions clearly, stands behind judgment calmly, and updates thinking without defensiveness. Over time, people learn something important. This person helps us think better. I noticed the shift when people started coming to me before decisions were fully formed, not to ask for answers, but to test their thinking. That didn't happen because I pushed harder. It happened because I stayed consistent in how I framed, challenged, and adjusted. Trusted thinking partners do 3 things repeatedly. First, they don't rush to advocate. They help clarify the decision before taking a position. The second, they hold their ground without drama. Disagreement doesn't make them louder or smaller. Third, they update their thinking publicly. When conditions change, they adjust without rewriting history. That builds credibility faster than being right. Influence at this level is not about control. It's about contribution. Leaders earn influence by making decisions clearer, trade-offs visible, and movement possible. That kind of influence doesn't fade when authority ends. So here's the distinction to remember. Lasting influence comes from how you think out loud, not how hard you argue. People trust those who make decisions easier to understand. When you want influence to grow, ask yourself this leadership check-in question. Am I trying to convince, or am I helping the system think better? If it's the system, influence will follow. In the wrap-up for this module, we'll pull these pieces together. How influence works without authority, how judgment becomes visible, and how leaders position themselves to operate at a higher level without changing who they are. In this module, we didn't talk about persuasion techniques or navigating politics. We focused on how leaders influence decisions when authority isn't theirs to use. That's where leadership actually gets tested. The habit we retired here was subtle and very common, trying to gain influence by being agreeable, impressive, or endlessly accommodating. That approach feels diplomatic, but it quietly weakens credibility. That's why we replace that habit with this operating rule. I influence by shaping how decisions are understood, not by pushing harder for agreement. Your stop doing commitment for this week. I want you to choose one conversation where you would normally add more data, more justification, or more reassurance to win the room. Commit to stopping the push. Instead, name the decision, restate the frame, and state your recommendation once, then pause. That rule changes how leaders show up in rooms that matter. Less force, less performance, more impact. We started by naming why competence alone doesn't translate into influence. Then we looked at how framing decisions comes before advocating for outcomes. We explored how leaders hold their ground without escalating or retreating. And finally, we talked about how influence compounds when leaders become trusted thinking partners over time. Influence at this level doesn't feel dramatic. It feels steady. Conversations are clearer, decisions move faster, and your perspective carries weight, even when it's challenged. That's not politics. That's leadership doing the work even without the title. If influence has felt hard in the past, it's rarely because leaders lacked credibility. More often, it's because decisions weren't framed clearly enough for others to engage with them. Influence doesn't require louder voices. It requires clearer thinking. This module completes the arc of this program, from judgment to accountability to strategic focus to developing others, and finally, to influence beyond your role. What ties all of this together is not confidence, charisma, or control. It's how leaders think, decide, and act when things aren't simple. As you move forward, I want you to notice one thing. When you stop trying to convince and start helping decisions become clearer, influence stops feeling like something you chase. It becomes something you carry with you. So your field application. In the next week, I want you to pick one decision that you need to influence upward or across. Before the meeting, write one sentence that names the decision and one sentence that states the frame, direction, trade-off, or risk. In the conversation, lead with those two sentences, then offer your recommendation. If challenged, acknowledge, restate the frame, and restate your position without elaborating. Now observe what changes in clarity, resistance, and movement.